Hello again. Jim McKinnell here, Director of the Office of Pre-Health Professions Student Development at the University of New Mexico. And we are talking one more time about various aspects of shadowing. This is part 3, if my count's correct. This is the third video that I've put together about shadowing. And today I specifically want to talk about communication. Communication is I've mentioned before, the bedrock of the relationship between a provider and any patient that they're caring for. If we are good communicators, we will be perceived as good healthcare providers. And if we are not good communicators, then that is also going to reflect on our reputation. And we are going to become very quickly and rather widely known as people that don't take very good care of their patients. So communication and doing it well and doing it effectively is a huge preoccupation. It's actually, we spend the first half of the first year of medical training at our medical school here, we spend teaching communication skills to our first year medical student and PA students. That's how important this is. So as a shadowing student, I want you to sort of be extremely sensitive to the communication, the things that you're hearing, as well as we also know there's nonverbal communication, the things that you're hearing and seeing as you're hanging out with your healthcare provider. And I want you to begin to develop the ability to make that judgment of, is my preceptor communicating effectively? So, what are the challenges? Well, I think first of all, we have to talk about vocabulary. And that's one of those things that all of us, I'm sure, have had the experience of sitting across from our healthcare provider of some kind at some point or other and have them go blah, 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 and said words that we recognize are English. But beyond that, we have no idea what those words mean. Now, it's not hard to see why this happens. All of you are someday going to enter health professions programs. You're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money, frankly, learning a lot of very big words. They're cool. I mean, they're really cool. But unless someone is sitting next to you on the day that you've learned those words in class, they're not going to understand what those words mean. And we need to remember that. So in other words, when you're communicating with other healthcare providers, and yes, it's perfectly appropriate vocabulary to be using, but not when we're talking to our patients. All right, so we've learned this great language, but now we also have to always remember that we have these great words, but we have to learn how to translate them back into English. Right now, I understand that a lot of you are going to be frustrated with that. And so it's really important, and I know that we have a chance to utilize those big words. It's great. And I mean, it does. It makes us feel cool. So I have a suggestion for you which worked really well for me, and I would sort of put it out there for you. Please take advantage of that. That suggestion is Thanksgiving dinner. So that as you're sitting around after you've finished, in your first and second years of medical school and you're acquiring this tremendous vocabulary, I want you to trot it out at home. You'll be sitting at the table, the turkey will be there, you'll be surrounded by family and loved ones, and that is totally the audience that you want to dump those words on. Because they're the ones that are going to go, ooh, ah, that's what we're spending our money for. All right, so use your big words then. Use them with your colleagues, but don't use them with your patients. And as you're shadowing, I hope that you don't hear your preceptors use them with their patients. Okay, now, I had mentioned before that all of us have an incredibly effective test for the efficacy. How well is our preceptor communicating with his patients? And that incredibly sensitive test is your own understanding of what your preceptor just said. Right, so that if you're in the room and you're listening intently and you're looking back and forth from the preceptor to the patient, you're totally engaged, and all of a sudden it occurs to you as, whoa, I have no idea what they just said. Then I want you to remember to look immediately at the face of the patient. And what I want you to look for in the face of that patient is any sign of recognition. I want you to look in their eyes, and I want you to see if in their eyes someplace there is this little light that goes on that says, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Because my bet is going to be that if you haven't understood what your preceptor has said, there is almost no chance that the patient has understood that. How do I know that? Well, you're all college educated. right? You're in a very, very small minority of people in the world that have that level of education and the vocabularies that you have. So if you haven't understood it, as I said, there's almost no chance that the patient has. So if you look over at the patient and you see this kind of blank look, or just like dumbstruck, if you see that look in the patient's face, then I need you to immediately look at the provider's face. Look at your preceptor's face. Has he recognized that look of non-comprehension in his patient? Really, really important. That's real important because they need to recognize that. Otherwise, they're just going to continue going blah, 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 blah. And meanwhile, they are not doing their job because their job is to effectively communicate these very real concerns they have about the patient's condition, their health condition. Right? Now, if you look at the patient and you see the blank look, and then you look at the provider and you see that look of, ooh, I haven't really done a good job. Now you need to listen. Now I want you to hear the efforts I want you to be aware of the efforts that the preceptor, the provider makes in order to rectify that problem. In other words, how does he change his words? How does he change the way he delivers that information to the patient so that they can understand it? All right? Really, really important. And at the end of an interaction, when you have a chance, and you will, when you have a chance to ask your preceptor a question, when you've been aware of these kinds of issues, one question that I want you to sort of feel free to explore with your preceptors is, if they are ever concerned that the information that they have to communicate to their patients is so complex that their patient literally hasn't understood it. Are they ever concerned that they haven't done that job, that they haven't conveyed it in a way that their patient has been able to understand it? And what do they do in those situations when they feel that discomfort? So that's a situation if we have both parties speaking English, right? But now let's toss in a situation which is pretty common here in New Mexico, which is you have a provider and a patient who are speaking as primary languages different languages. I have to say that the language combination that turns up most frequently in my clinic when I was doing patient care was I speak English and do not speak Spanish, and many of my patients and their families were Spanish speaking. Now we have a different situation. One of the things that I want to point out to you is that if you look, almost every healthcare facility somewhere has posted a patient's Bill of Rights. And I want you all, as shadowing students, I want you all to take a minute and read what those are, because it's important for you as future healthcare providers to understand that your patients will have rights. Those rights are outlined. And one of those rights of the patient is to receive their medical information in their primary language. Really, really important. And it is the responsibility of the provider to make that possible. And we make that possible by arranging for an interpreter to be present with us, an interpreter in person. We can have an interpreter now via television, and we can also have interpreters via telephone. But we need to make it, as providers, we need to have a certified interpreter present in order to help us convey the information that we need to in a form that our patients will understand. When I talk to students, I often ask them if for students, if any of them grew up in homes where English was not the primary language spoken, and many of my students have. The second question that I ask is, have any of them ever been asked, when they were children, had they ever been asked to serve as translators for their parents, either in a medical setting, in some other kind of business setting, maybe at a drugstore? And frequently I see lots of heads nodding up and down. Yes, they have. That should never happen. Never. Because you have to remember, and this is something you need to be aware of as you're shadowing, if you're looking at a 12-year-old who has happened maybe have had 6 or 7 years of education here in the United States and speaks English very well, and they may speak English much better than their parents who are Spanish speakers of some other language. They may speak English better than their parents, but they are still 12. They're still doing vocabulary lists in school. They have the vocabulary of a 12-year-old. They have the understanding of the nuances of language of a 12-year-old. None of us want to hear critical information given to us, translated for us by a child. An extension of that, or an alternative to that, is often that providers will frequently ask patients to bring along a family friend or someone who can, another maybe relative who can translate for them. This is also totally inappropriate, because now what you're asking the patient to do is put themselves in a position where they are required to share privileged information. Their healthcare information is privileged and is something that should only be shared between them and their provider. You're now putting them in a position as the provider that's demanding that they provide their own translator. You're putting them in the position where you're requiring them to share that privileged information with another family member or a family acquaintance. Again, totally inappropriate, and something that you may or may not. I hope you don't see this when you're shadowing, but it's something that you may see, and it's something that also, I think that if you do, we want to talk about, you want to think about what that means and what that might mean, the situation that places the patient in. It's a horrible situation, and as I said, I hope that none of you ever see it. So I mentioned before that it's the responsibility of the provider to make sure that an interpreter's in the room. The last situation that has occurred with me, which is a little bit funny, but is also, again, I just want to point out, because you may have a chance to see it. I've walked into a room and I've greeted a family I've never met before, and I hear a little bit of an accent when they say hello. And the first question I always ask before I even start is, should I get an interpreter? And I've often had the experience where the families say, no, it's not necessary. We're good. And so I start talking, and I say a few sentences, and all of a sudden, the one parent, the dad turns to the mom, or mom turns to the dad, doesn't matter. But one of the parents turns to the other and goes, blah, 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 blah. And the other parent looks at the other one and goes, blah, blah. And then the other parent goes, blah, 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 blah. And the other parent goes, blah, blah. And then they look at me and go, okay. And I'm like going, okay, wait a minute. I'm not sure what happened right then, but I'm pretty sure that conversation, which I have no understanding of, that conversation had to do with something that I said that they're trying to figure out between the two of them. In that case, that tells me that we need an interpreter. I need to make sure that the words that come out of my mouth are understood by my patient and their family. And in order to be absolutely certain of that, once the doubt is raised, I need to make sure that there's an interpreter in the room who can do that for me. So those are all variations on sort of some of the challenges of communication, of language in a provider-patient encounter. Be sensitive to them. Be sensitive of all the variations of them. If you see something that you're curious about or troubled about, I want you to, again, take advantage of your preceptors. Explore those issues. Obviously, you want to explore them in a sensitive kind of way. We're certainly not going to come accusing our preceptors of being bad communicators or anything like that. But definitely kind of explore it of like, what are the challenges that they've faced, and what are the efforts? What are some of the different strategies that they've developed to overcome those challenges? Thanks for tuning in. There may yet be one more, maybe a little bit more to talk about with shadowing. I'll give it some thought, but in the meantime, this is Jim McKinnell, Director of the Office of Pre-Health Professions Student Development at the University of New Mexico. This is Planning for a Career in Healthcare. Thanks for tuning in. Again, please share with your friends if you found this at all helpful, interesting, enlightening in any way. Thanks a lot.